Why do we no longer build beautifully? When we look around many modern cities today, it's easy to feel like something has been lost. Not just craftsmanship, not just ornamentation, but meaning and a sense of place. For over a century, architecture has been trapped between two extremes: ornament or efficiency, form versus function. For thousands of years, architecture was art. The pyramids were built to look to the stars. The Greeks developed the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns, not only to hold structural value, but also to symbolize strength, grace, and beauty. The difference between technology and art was nothing. They were synonymous with one another. But then towards the end of the 19th century, due to the Industrial Revolution, there was a change in this. There was a schism, so to speak, where technology was advanced so quickly, it kind of left art in the Dark Ages. You had the new inventions of steel that allowed us to create huge skyscrapers. You had the advancements in glass where you can now have huge open windows. But art and the decoration side, it almost stayed stagnant. So across the pond in America, you had things like the arts and crafts movements. But then here in Europe, you had the birth of modernism. And this was kind of started with the likes of Le Corbusier and also with Walter Gropius and the Bauhaus. But they had their own interpretations of what art and architecture should be. You had the likes of Adolf Loos, who would say that ornament is a crime, whatever that means. You also had Le Corbusier saying that a house is a machine for living in. Two ideas that personally I could never get behind. This is what leads us down the road of having cold, austere facades that are just kind of white boxes everywhere. And this sort of minimalist approach completely gets warped as time progresses. But there was one modernist architect who tried to bridge this gap between art and technology. And he did it in such a famous case study that we all know today as the Barcelona Pavilion. So to tell you more about this, I'm going to go on a site visit to the Barcelona Pavilion and tell you everything I know about it. I feel like any good architect worth their salt will already know where I am. I am at the Lily Reich Pavilion. But you haven't heard that before. I am at the Mies van der Rohe Pavilion, also known as the Barcelona Pavilion, also the German Pavilion, and really it depends who you ask. But it was designed by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Lily Reich, which I think gets kind of lost in the history of this place a little bit. But it was originally constructed in 1929 for the Expo, but subsequently it was demolished, as are basically everything in most of the expos that you ever go to. But because it became such a case study for architects all over the world to go and visit and enjoy, they reconstructed it in 1989. Like I said, this is the brainchild of Ludwig and Lily. And what makes this place so worth mentioning or so worth come visiting is basically the thing that captivates every architecture student when they first begin the journey. But by the time they research this place, learn about it, why it's so influential, you can't help but marvel just at how beautiful, beautiful this place is. To give you an overview, it is a pavilion made up of steel, glass, marble, and water. There's two pools down either end of it, and they're both kind of encased by these large marble walls. When you look at the marble, you'll notice that they're all matchbook marble. That's what we call it in the industry anyway. And this is where the marble has been cut in half, obviously, and then split open almost like a book. And then when you match these up, you can make these beautiful, beautiful patterns that like line up perfectly. Very, very expensive to do if you want to do it in your house. But for a pavilion such as this, it was revolutionary. It was so nice. you a little bit of maybe context into why this piece became the new modernist standard for all buildings nearly going forward, you have to understand that there was this man called Gottfried Siegfried, and he had a criticism of architecture and engineering kind of in like the 19th century, where he felt that architecture and engineering were diverging apart, that engineers were making great use out of kind of newer materials like steel and glass and making incredible structures. But architects were kind of lazying behind, staying with kind of the materials that they already knew and they already wanted to build out of. And so there was this sort of schism, as he calls it, where things were clearly separated between what was architectural and then what was considered just engineering. And what Ludwig and Lily really kind of managed to do here was blend the two. So they are using 8 columns put on a grid, which is very architectural, but the columns that you can see just behind me, they are not I-beam shaped columns. They are cross-section columns, which means they're not necessarily the most structurally efficient, but it's this blending of beauty with structure that is kind of the tying of the manifesto that's going on here. So you have all these beautiful matchbook marble walls, like I said, but they don't actually hold up the roof. It's all of these 8 columns. And the fact that the columns are then kind of encased in polished makes them beautiful. So it's that combination of trying to show that structure and engineering can also be beautiful. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Does that make sense? I hope that does. Yeah, even having like these grand expanses of glass, that wasn't really possible, previously. And so getting to make such a beautiful pavilion, have these huge open glass walls that don't need to form any part of the structure. And then you have the roof that oversails it and kind of blends the indoor and outdoor feel of the place, and the water especially, making it just feel like it's kind of never ending and boom, escapism. Yeah, I love it here. I gotta say, this is quite the treat, guys. Very, very beautiful. So you might be asking, how did we go from this international style of architecture that was so richly design-based and it merged the art and the architecture together to what was later to become of modernism? Well, in a large part, we kind of have the Nazis to blame for this, and that is that they shut down the Bauhaus. So Mies van der Rohe was the final director of the Bauhaus. It got shut down. He moved it to Berlin, and then it got shut down again by the Nazis. So at that point, Mies tries to work with them, not work with them, but he tries to see where things can go. And eventually he just decides this is enough, and he escapes to Chicago. He goes in 1938 and he starts to work in the Chicago School of Architecture, somewhere I would love to visit in the future. But that's more or less where he takes these ideals that we can merge art and architecture, and he brings that to America, leaving post-war Europe in shambles and in the hands of people like Corbusier, someone I'm not a huge fan of, okay? But you had, in the post-war era, you needed, speed, efficiency, and it needed to be cost effective. This is how Europe rebuilt itself so quickly after the wars. And that is really where modernism takes its stride. It's where you have the kind of subsects of modernism like brutalism, where you can pour huge pieces of concrete and inhabit them very quickly. But the issue is that this kind of takes on a life of its own, and then you start to get really, really ugly buildings like this and this and this. But moving on from that, we then had a pushback against these with the postmodernism movement, and people started to try reconnect old ideas like the Corinthian column, but reinterpret it into modern architecture. This ultimately failed because it was a little bit shite. There's no polite way of putting that, but a lot of it was very pastiche and just ugly. This then swung us again. We're kind of moving from super efficiency and minimalism to overly artistic. And today we're kind of caught in two camps where we have the modern minimalism, which is all developer driven projects. And everything is just down to the money. It's all designed on spreadsheets. Everything you see today is just, how do we make this as cost effective as possible? And none of the actual really beautiful design work like Mies was doing in the Barcelona Pavilion ever really comes into play. You're never given the opportunity to make a column, polished steel and make it in this cross section rather than an I-beam, because everyone's just like, why would you do that? That's just not as strong. So now we're in that movement of this versus contemporary modern architecture. And this is the likes of, your Zaha Hadids and your Frank Gehry's, and they're designing all these wacky new structures. And yes, they do couple technology with art, but they do it at such a scale that it's not actually possible to build like your average person's house in these styles. And that's kind of the disconnect, because then you have people either doing really lavish new buildings, or you have people just doing the bare minimum. And my suggestion, my humble suggestion moving forward, is that we try to bridge these two things together again. We take the artistic side of architecture and the minimalism side of architecture, but you try to intertwine them. You design out these ugly blank facades, and then you enrich them with new materials, with new modes of construction that are quicker, more efficient, and cheaper, but can also be beautiful. This is where we're going wrong in our society today. If the architecture we produce is a reflection of society, then what does this say about us?